ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Live, this is Point of View. Now, Kerby Anderson.
The topic of the first hour is about the persecuted Christians in the Middle East. And, of course, if you've been listening to this program any length of period of time, you know when we've talked with former Representative Frank Wolf about the fact that we have individuals that basically have, as Christians, lived for almost 2,000 years in this land and have been pushed out by ISIS. And so we've talked about their plight. Of course, we've talked about that with people like Johnny Moore. And really, because of your generosity, we've sent about $60,000 to the Cradle Fund to help persecuted Christians. So I know this is an issue you're well aware of, but we're going to get into it in a lot more detail today as we have a chance to talk with Mindy Belz. She is the senior editor of World Magazine. And, of course, we've had many individuals, World Magazine, on this program over the years. She has really actually been covering so much of this in the Balkans, Sudan, Iraq, Afghanistan. In the past, she's also reported from places like Nigeria and Syria. You've seen some of her articles in certainly, of course, World Magazine, but also in the Weekly Standard. She's appeared on Fox News and ABC News, a number of different talk shows. In the past, she worked on Capitol Hill and even attended George Washington University, but of course has been located there in Asheville, North Carolina, which is where about the circumstances that we find in the Middle East, and then we want to tell some of the stories. But is it fair to say that in some respects we've always had some kind of ancestors or remnants of Christian expression, maybe a little bit different theologically, but nevertheless Christians in this land until ISIS came and pushed them out?
Right. You know, it's interesting. When I was doing research for the book that I've just written about this, that it turned out that at the time of Jesus' birth, there were 1 million Jews living in the area that we now think of as Iraq. So, you know, that was a center of Judaism going back to the time of the Babylonian exile and Assyrian exile, and it became a center that was very receptive to Christianity. And so it's not unusual to travel throughout areas north of Baghdad up to what we call Nineveh Plain and around the city of Mosul to find churches and monasteries that date back to the 2nd and 3rd century.
Well, again, just an incredible. By the way, talking about this book, They Say We Are Infidels, On the Run from ISIS with Persecuted Christians in the Middle East. We have quite a bit of information about that book. You probably can find it in your local bookstore because it's getting some level of press, but it is published by Tyndale. We have a place for you to order it if you'd like to do so. Also, of course, we have a link to theysayweareinfidels.com. You don't have to remember all that. We have the link there that will make it easier for you to find the website there and a number of other things that are important. And one of the things that people will notice, Mindy, is that Arabic symbol, which is for N for that has been used by ISIS to identify Christians, but many people are familiar with that symbol because oftentimes Christians who are trying to show solidarity with those persecuted Christians sometimes post it on their website or on their Facebook page.
Right. It became a symbol of this whole conflict when ISIS came into Iraq in 2014. And in the city of Mosul and then out in many of the villages in Nineveh Plain, I've actually visited some of them and have seen these houses and corner posts where ISIS marked property that had belonged to Christians. And keep in mind that they confiscated all of that. They weren't just content to run them out. They insisted on having deeds to property, making it really impossible for them to return.
Wow. So let's, if we can, tell some of the stories, and certainly one person that you follow through the book, hope I'm saying her name right, Insaf Safu. And this is an incredible story because even as people pick up the book, there's a quote from her where no one knows where is safe anymore. So how did you first meet her? And let's, if we can, tell a little bit of her story.
Yeah, in March of 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, and a few months after that, I flew into Baghdad with INSAF. We had been linked together through a mutual friend who's working in Jordan. And I was an American reporter covering an American war, but I didn't know the significance that would be in hooking up with an Iraqi Christian. By flying into Baghdad with INSAF and then beginning to meet her family, beginning to hear about her church life and her just the everyday life for Christians in Iraq, I had this entryway into this world that I think is far different from what most of us in the West have picked up from reading the headlines throughout this war period. We tend to think of Iraq as a country divided between Sunni and Shiite Muslims, when in fact it is quite a patchwork quilt of many ethnic and religious groups dating back thousands of years.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, while we're mentioning some of those, we've talked about the Kurds in Kurdistan, right, and we've talked about a number of other different Muslim sects or groups. So it is very much, as you said, a patchwork quilt. And one of the struggles I think we could look at just from a political point of view is you have Kurds in the north, you have Sunnis somewhat in the middle, and Shiites in the south. And Shiites are probably more like those in Iran than they are like some of the people in Iraq. There have even been suggestions, even by our current vice president, of splitting the country up. Not that that would necessarily work, but it just illustrates again how difficult it is to get any kind of cohesion, because in the midst of all those other groups, of course, there are the Christian groups as well.
That's right. And, there are Sunni Kurds and Shia Kurds, and there are Yazidis. We haven't talked about
Yazidis, yeah.
Certainly, one of the sects that have suffered the most under ISIS. Located in Iraq in the north again too. So it's an amazing amazing country, and I think that we have sort of shortchanged the people of Iraq by not appreciating the diversity that they've been accustomed to and trying to preserve that diversity throughout this last decade.
Well, and one of the other questions certainly people are going to have, and we'll open up the phones to give people a chance a little bit later to join the conversation, is it seems like we right now, as a foreign policy and even as an immigration policy, seem to favor the Muslims over the Christians. There are many more Muslims that have come into this country from Iraq, Syria, and other places than Christians. And one of the themes that kind of runs through your book is, if indeed we're a Christian nation, why is it that the Christians seem to be the ones facing the greatest persecution and aren't necessarily being helped by American foreign policy?
I think that that's right. I think that that U.S. foreign policy sought out to do this kind of take a non-sectarian approach. Throughout the time period that we had troops on the ground in Iraq, we were pushing for elections. We were pushing for a new constitution. We were trying to ignore the religious dimensions, and I think whether you are Muslim or whether you're a Christian, you have a religious framework. And to try to come in and do policy in a country where everyone is coming from some sort of religious framework, and to try to take that dimension out of it just isn't going to work. And so I think we have hurt ourselves, and we've hurt the people with those religious viewpoints as well.
Sure. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Mindy Belz, who is the senior editor at World Magazine. The book is entitled They Say We Are Infidels, On the Run from ISIS with Persecuted Christians in the Middle East, and it is published by Tyndale. And we'll come back and take some of your phone calls and give you a chance to join the conversation. All that coming up right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
When California Governor Jerry Brown announced his plan to be the first state to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, lots of people had an opinion. Dr. Merrill Matthews, a frequent guest on Point of View, summarized his thoughts this way. As a Texan, let me say thank you, Governor Brown. He pointed out that Texas has benefited from the Golden State's efforts will continue for years to come. Now, in case you're wondering, the number of Californians moving to Texas has hit an all-time high in nearly a decade. According to the IRS, it compiles migration data by looking at the address changes in the tax forms.
Many of these people may be leaving for better job opportunities or fewer regulations, but increasing the minimum wage in California will also hasten the flight from the states. Talk show host Dan Celia predicted that there would be lots of bankruptcies throughout California by 2022. He couldn't believe that politicians in California wanted to do this in light of previous experiences elsewhere. Perhaps he speculated that politicians thought what happened in the state of Washington was just some sort of weird anomaly that is not going to happen anywhere else in the world. He reminds us that fast food chains had to lay off people and start pushing for automation systems, and is sure that there will be fewer people working as a result of the $15 hour wage. Of course, some workers will benefit because they will see their wages jump from $10 an hour to $15 an hour. Others will be laid off, but it won't stop there. People working for $12 an hour who have seniority won't be happy making $15 an hour, the same wage as someone new to the job. So they will demand a higher wage. In the end, wages might go up, but job opportunities will go down. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Mindy Belz, who is the senior editor for World Magazine. The new book out, They Say We Are Infidels, on the run from ISIS with Persecuted Christians in the Middle East. And if you'd like to join us at any point, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. Number of endorsements by individuals that have been on this program, people like Eric Metaxas and Michael Cromartie, as well as Frank Wolf and many others. And it is broken into really three parts. And Mindy, let's, if we can, maybe focus a little bit more on part one, the war and peace. You came, of course, as that almost like a war correspondent, but there is a sense in which the war changed everything. Not that life for Christians was great under Saddam Hussein, but there was a sense in which the factions that unfolded and then some of the rivalries, especially the various religious and tribal rivalries, probably hurt them, didn't it?
Yes. When the U.S. came in 2003, there was a tremendous amount of hope and expectation. And Insaf Safu, that we've mentioned, was just one of hundreds of Christians who returned, who had been forced out for one reason or another under Saddam Hussein. They came back. They were opening churches. They had just a tremendous amount of hope that basically that Iraq would be like the United States, that there was going to be a new era of democracy and freedom that they had never known before. Mm-hmm. So you saw a lot of churches opening, and that's where this book begins. Some of them grew very quickly. One that I attended in late 2003 went on to go from having 200 members to 400, and then 500, and then 800. And that wasn't that unusual. Churches in the north were growing as well. People were starting new churches. Just a tremendous sense of freedom and of high expectations. But as you recall, by 2004, early 2004, and then proceeding on through 2005, this Islamic militancy took hold. The United States was not prepared for that, did not have a plan for dealing with it, and the Christians weren't prepared for it either, and they were certainly left out of the political process, and that really began to hurt them as they were targeted by Al-Qaeda-linked groups and other militants in various cities. In 2006, there was a major bombing, and 6 churches at one, a coordinated attack on 6 churches. And there was very little help for them, either from U.S. forces on the ground or from the Iraqi forces, and they had very little political cover. So what they were seeing is that things hadn't changed that much.
And what I think was also happening at the same time is you had all these different groups, most of which we've never heard of. I first heard about them in your book, Jude al-Islam and Ansar al-Islam, and a lot of them that were sort of like a Taliban-like group. And you would see that in the Kurdish region and others. So there, it was, we went there to try to end any kind of oppression. The president originally said he wasn't going to be involved in nation building, but that's sort of what it devolved in eventually. But during that whole period of time, you had all these different factions, and essentially the Christians got caught in the crosshairs, didn't they?
That's right. And, we also went into Iraq broadly to combat terrorism, and here were these groups springing up. And the groups in the north in particular that the Kurds were battling early on in the U.S.-led war, the U.S. just wasn't paying that much attention to them. We were focused otherwise, and we were focused on major cities. And I think that we sort of overlooked initially a threat that would grow. And what's tragic about this, Kerby, is that it's kind of the same pattern as what happened again in 2013, 2014, when we could see the chaos in Syria and its civil war bleeding back into Iraq, and we weren't paying proper attention to it.
Well, again, that maybe is something, just as we might digress for just a minute, to say that as we are in the midst of an election season, we need to pay attention to whether or not we have presidential candidates and members of the United States Senate and Congress that maybe have an understanding of that and are willing to direct us in a way that is going to be more profitable in the future. If we're going to spend so much in blood and treasure, sending troops and other kinds of forces, even those to build hospitals and roads to these areas, we need to be able to, I think, be assured that there is going to be something lasting that will remain. And that's, of course, a question that many of our listeners have. And if I could be so blunt, I think you even have a quote in here, if I remember that, from the Lawrence of Arabia, because there are just some that have wondered whether or not we ever can bring that kind of peace to that region of the world.
Mm-hmm. I think 2 things have hampered us, and one has corruption and to lead to all kinds of, and again, going back to talking about this is a very diverse country, it's going to be very hard to have a single leader who does not have some kind of significant coalition that crosses these ethnic and religious boundaries. We didn't push for that kind of government in Iraq. And then the second thing is just simply the U.S. military's rules of engagement, where as insurgency grows, we tend to require our soldiers to stay, behind the wire. They aren't allowed to be out and to take risks, but part of those taking risks means that you have a connection to the people on the ground. And we need that kind of intelligence. We need to understand who are these people that we're fighting among. We can't simply regard all of them as terrorists. Many of them regard, or at least at one time, regarded themselves as America's friends, and they have felt betrayed over and over again, and I would draw particular attention to the Christian community that way.
I would think so. I did quote a minute ago from Lawrence of Arabia, and you do have that. T.E. Lawrence, in a letter to his mother back, and this goes back to 1916, says, Mesopotamia will be a wonderful country someday when they will regulate the floods and dig out the irrigation ditches. Yet it will never be a really pleasant country or a country where Europeans can live a normal life. And, that letter now getting close to, I guess you could honestly now say, 100 years ago, still nevertheless reminds us of some of the ambivalence that even Americans have about was our military involvement there worthwhile? Did we make the right decisions? Have we left it in a place where there could be a possibility for democracy to grow? And Mindy, I guess that's one of the big questions, because if indeed so much of the country is Muslim,
As a woman who went over there, you're well aware of the fact that in a Muslim country, if you have the Quran as the basis of your ideas, then a woman's right is not the same than a non-Muslim, and it's really sometimes difficult to grow a democracy or a republic on a Muslim soil, isn't it?
That's right. And that was a turning point early on in U.S. involvement in Iraq, that we actively participated in a constitution that that in fact enshrined the role of the Quran in guiding the country. I can't remember which article, but it's early on in the Constitution, one of the articles of the Constitution that we helped draft. I was sitting in a State Department meeting with some Iraqis, several Christians who were complaining about that and complaining about several articles in the Constitution that left unclear the rights of minorities. And one of the people at a State Department meeting said, "Hey, I helped draft that Constitution." So we were part of this process, and we know better. We know the value of the First Amendment in this country. We know how vital it is to preserve religious liberty for everyone. And I think Iraq is unfortunately a tragic example of what part right.
And again, we only had it in our country once you had some of those Judeo-Christian principles there as well. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into a second section. First, we've been talking about war and peace, then chasing peace, and then a little bit later, inside the house of war. And we'll get into a little bit more of the leader of ISIS, for example, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and what ISIS is all about, and how, in some respects, peace wasn't peaceful. It's all part of the book, They Say We Are Infidels, on the run from ISIS with persecuted Christians in the Middle East. And we're privileged to have with us today Mindy Belz, who has, of course, been a reporter in these various hotspots around the world, and also is the senior editor of World Magazine. If you go to the website and click next to her picture there, we also have a link to TheySayWeAreInfidels.com. You don't have to remember all that because we have the link there, and that has information, free downloads, a little bit more about the author, some reviews, a way that you can purchase it. And so, again, as we talk about the importance of praying for persecuted Christians, and as many of you have done, given to the Cradle Fund to help those who are in those refugee camps and to help pastors reach out, we certainly encourage you to also find out more about this book, and some of the resources are available. Let's take a break. When we come back, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212, or just sit back and listen to our conversation with Mindy Belz. All that coming up right after this.
Is it just me, or does this year's election seem more contentious than ever? Even Christians are divided between which candidate to support, but one thing we must agree upon is the need to pray together. Each and every one of us must be on our knees asking God's mercy. Who is the right one to name the next Supreme Court justice, or 2 or 3? Honestly, I don't know, but God does, and we must petition Him to act. Point of View has created its own campaign in the midst of the presidential campaign, Pray, Organize, Vote. We want to remind you of things to pray about. We want to help you educate fellow believers and get them out to vote. Sign up today at pointofview.net. Click on the banner, Pray, Organize, and Vote. The future of America is at stake, and God's people are called to be good stewards of our votes. After you sign up, look at the bottom right corner for the red box that says Donate. Your gift will educate and motivate Christians during this critical time. Don't put it off. Visit now, pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Talking about persecuted Christians, and if you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. What have you been doing, perhaps in your church, at least to pray for persecuted Christians? Of course, we've tried to give you some action items when we've had people like Johnny Moore on, as we've talked about his book, Defying ISIS. He was the one that suggested we might want to raise funds for the Cradle Fund, and as I said, about $60,000 that you gave, and we just passed it through. It all went to those individuals, primarily pastors in some of those refugee camps, ministering to those individuals that were displaced. And recognize that some of these people left their homes in the midst of a crisis, maybe sometimes with not much more than the clothes on their back, and then had to endure the winters and had to engage in all sorts of things that most of us could not even possibly have imagined. And I thought that would be good. There was a time in which there was maybe hope for that, but during this time, radical groups, and perhaps the most significant one, the one that's in the subtitle of your book, is the Islamic State. And you have Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and others that are providing that leadership, and they have very quickly displaced the Christians. So tell us what you found in terms of that particular human rights tragedy.
Well, that began in 2014 very quickly with for the Christians who were living in Mosul and living in the north. ISIS came down from the northern part of Syria and fought Iraqi army forces for a few days, but then we all remember the pictures of the Iraqi army uniforms laying strewn across the streets as the army fled, and ISIS took over the city of Mosul. It's a city of 2 million people, forcing about 30,000 Christians from the city to run. And as we talked at the beginning about how they were given the option of converting, leaving, and if they stayed without converting, they would be killed. And we know, in fact, that a number of people who did try to stay or who went back, hoping to reclaim some of their belongings, were found dead in their homes subsequently. So you had the emptying of the city of Mosul, and then you had the emptying of this vast area of Nineveh Plain that includes the city of Karakosh, which has for a long time been a majority Christian city. It does have a significant Muslim population as well. All the Christians were forced out of Karakosh and were forced into the north, and giving us a situation that really has remained remarkably unchanged since that time, of the Kurdish forces in the north holding this 600-plus mile-long line against ISIS, which still has control of Mosul and large parts of Nineveh Plain.
And I might just mention that you have a picture or a map in the area there to give you a little bit of an idea where that battle has been taking place. And we've had Heather on the program showing pictures that she has in the past of even seeing the ISIS forces on the other side. So there are some really incredible things happening. But just from a historical point of view for a minute, when we call it the Nineveh Plain or even Mosul, that used to be called Nineveh. And so there is a tremendous amount of, if you will, biblical history there as well. There was reputed to be the burial ground of Jonah. Not sure that really was the case, but that I think illustrates again that this has been occupied by individuals who were either Jewish or then later Christians for almost 2 millennia, right?
Right, that's right. Outside of Mosul, multiple times I've visited a town of Al-Qush, and Al-Qush, if you remember from your minor prophets, is the home of Nahum the prophet. And there's actually a synagogue in the middle of the city. It's a small town built on a hillside, and it did become a majority Christian town. But it had, until about the 1940s and early 1950s, significant Jewish population. And the synagogue contained the tomb, again, we think, of Nahum the prophet. And this area took very seriously its history. Al-Qush was evacuated as ISIS came into Nineveh area, and actually they were able to keep control of that city, and the residents most of them have been able to return, but not all of them did. Some of them were too afraid to go back, and it is very close even today to the front lines with ISIS.
Let's, if we can, talk about ISIS for just a minute. ISIS is part of the Islamic State, and the Islamic State is based upon this idea of having a caliphate, or kind of a supranational, if you will, government in which Sharia law is implemented. They are Sunni, which explains why ISIS will kill other Muslims that might be Shiite, certainly be willing to kill Jews and Christians. But what can we learn about ISIS and their intentions and how they have so significantly changed the landscape of that region?
Well, Islamic State, or ISIS, does want to return the world, I would say, certainly this part of the world, back to the time of the early caliphates back around the 700s somewhere. And, you know, it's interesting, even the geography they have followed, because under Caliph Mansur at one time, Baghdad was the capital of the Islamic world, and he set as kind of his outpost Raqqa, which is this town in northern Syria. That was the first town that ISIS captured, and their headquarters are there today. And that was captured because it was considered to be the city that faced Rome, in other words, the Western world. Very symbolic, very important. ISIS wasn't just a guerrilla movement trying to succeed wherever they could. This is a very well-planned, organized insurgency, and they captured Raqqa in Syria, facing the West, and they've talked numerous times in their literature about attacking Rome, attacking the West. Then they came down into Mosul. And the presumption in Iraq, and I think it's a very safe one, is that ISIS will not be content until they have captured Baghdad and sort of completing the region of this caliphate. But Baghdadi, as you have mentioned, the leader of ISIS, has gone on and, has said in his speeches, he will say, the earth is Allah's, and that is his call to arms. His Islamic movement will be neither black nor white. It will be neither Arab nor non-Arab. It will encompass the whole world. So he has some pretty high goals there.
I would think so. Let's, if we can, even talk a little bit about the theology, since you do that, the coming of a new caliphate, because Muhammad divided the world into two. Dar al-Islam, which was, of course, the House of Islam, and the Dar al-Harb, which is the House of War. And the idea that I understand, and maybe you can help us with this as well, is that the only time we will have peace is when those who are part of the House of War, and that would be United States, that would be Israel, that would be all the infidels, using the title of your book, when are willing to lay down their arms. And as a result, there is a universal caliphate. So their definition in Islam, especially the ISIS definition of peace, is that it is a time when you all surrender and submit, because, again, the idea of Islam is the idea of submission to the will of Allah. So we find ourselves, whether we agree with it or not, from ISIS' point of view, as part of the House of War. And so they are dedicated to destroying and removing all infidels from that region. True?
That's right. And it's not, there's no peaceful coexistence here. There are no ceasefires to be negotiated, no terms of peace. This is, as you've said, all-out submission and a total conquering and into what would be a religious state. A state where everyone who is under the political power of ISIS or Islamic State would be required also to convert religiously.
And if they do not, and they are even there, they have to pay what's called the jizya. You talk about that as well, or a tribute. And that existed in the past. And again, when people say, as you say, they give the choice. You can leave, or you can stay and pay the jizya or the tribute, or you can die. Those are really the three options that ISIS gives to you. True?
Yeah, and the tax is really just kind of a temporary state. I mean, we've heard from Christians who have escaped. Christians who stayed in some of the cities under ISIS control in Syria, and now some of the Christians who tried to coexist with ISIS in Iraq. They quickly found out that the taxes would go up every time it was time to pay them.
Right.
And that really the taxes were just a form of extortion to force them, compel them to convert, and that ultimately they were going to, one way or another, face a death penalty. And it's this whole idea of total submission, and the taxes are just one way to exert that. And I think, it helps us, Kerby, to understand these horrible, horrible atrocities that I think we otherwise just don't know what to do with. The beheadings that we have seen. We know that in Mosul and Raqqa and other places, ISIS has taken churches and other Christian locations and has turned them into prisons that are housing rape victims. And this repeated rape and these horrible beheadings are all designed to subjugate people, make people give up.
We'll talk a little bit more about this right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Mindy Belz with us for just a few more minutes as we talk about her book, They Say We Are Infidels. And again, we have links to that website on our website, pointofview.net. It is also published by Tyndale. You should probably be able to find it in your local bookstore, but also wanted to talk a little bit more about Inside the House of War. And there's a section in your book, Mindy, where you actually quote from a pamphlet that was made available by ISIS as you were talking about this issue of rape, where there are a series of questions. And again, since this is a family show, I won't get into all the details, but nevertheless, it talks
freedom that ISIS leaders have in taking women, raping women, selling them as property, giving them as gifts. Anybody that thinks that this is something that's been made up, all you have to do is look at some of the documentation you have in your book about the kind of pamphlets that were handed out to the ISIS fighters.
That's right. And even more recently, the genocide report that came out from the Knights of Columbus included some of these pamphlets and included a detailed rate scale. So in other words, younger girls were worth less than women, in their 20s, and then as women get older, they're worth less again. So there is a minister in the Islamic State who runs this sort of thing and is overseeing these, what they call brothels, houses of prostitution, but they are forced, they are women who have been forced into that kind of, into prostitution and have been raped forcibly and violently. We know because there are a number in the north of Iraq, there are a number of government officials, health officials who are working with some of the women who have been freed from. If you have 100 women from a village, 50 of them will be traumatized because of what they've been through.
Wow. We've had Heather Mercer on this program. Heather Mercer and Dana Curry were those who were taken captive by the Taliban. And, of course, I have an office almost next to her, and so she's over there right now in Kurdistan, but has also had a chance to interview some of the women that have been able to escape some of those various activities, and, of course, again, gives verification for that. But, Mindy, we have quite an activist audience. A lot of people are probably thinking, okay, well, I'll certainly pray for persecuted Christians, but I've always looked for ways in which we can do something more, and that's why when we had Johnny Moore on, we encouraged people to give towards the Cradle Fund. And can you still have lots of individuals that are either in cities of refuge or they're in refugee camps, or in one way or another, they're obviously displaced? What could we possibly do? Are there action items that you could give to us?
There are, and I've been amazed by the number of ways that I see people helping in this situation. We, over at World Magazine, keep a page on our homepage called Iraq Aid, or Aid to Iraqis, and where we list a number of organizations. The Cradle Fund is one, and others that I and others have witnessed doing firsthand legit relief work and working specifically with these Christians that we've been talking about. I would mention one group whose work I've followed very closely, and they've been in Iraq for a long time, is Servant Group International out of Nashville.
Okay.
And they have been involved in setting up schools in the north, and what I think is unique is that they, for a long time, have been involved in education of Muslim students. Their student population would be mostly Muslim, and yet their faculty would include some Christians. One thing that they have done since this crisis began is they actually were able to stand up a school in one of the UN refugee camps. The UN school that they were trying to build was still just walls, and this group opened a school for Yazidis. The school is run by a number of people who include American Christians, and who himself was displaced by ISIS, came to them and said, would you take in our school students from Mosul? And so they have, so in other words, you have a school that includes Christian administrators and faculty teaching Muslims and Yazidis together.
Wow, very
and
good.
This is the kind of thing that, we all know that God can work good out of evil, and these are just tiny pockets of where I've seen it happen. I have went to a Bible study that was involved a number of people from displaced families. They had been able to move into an apartment building. They were able to actually have a Bible study and to start thinking about starting a church in their apartment building. And their rent, they had been helped in paying their rent by a church in Indiana. The church in Indiana contacted a pastor via Facebook, began to start a relationship that way, made a trip there. So there are all kinds of ways that I think people can help. once they put their hearts and their minds and some effort into it.
Let me give you that link again. It's worldmag.com, worldmag.com, and then as you go across the right-hand side on one of the toll bars, you will see Aid for Iraqis. So again, that's a place where you can go at worldmag.com. And I would be remiss, Mindy, if I didn't spend just a minute talking about World Magazine. Every time I've ever had Marvin Olasky on or any of the other individuals, we always talk about how it is a magazine that I think every listener should get a copy of. So, Mindy, what would you say about World Magazine and how people can either get it in print form or digitally?
Well, it's easy to do that because it all comes at one price, one monthly price, and by signing up as a member on our website, you can receive the magazine every 2 weeks. You have access to our daily news on our website, and you also have access to a daily podcast called The World and Everything in It, which is this wide-ranging scope of news. We try to cover news from around the world and about the world, and we try to do it from a Christian perspective.
Well, again, say hi to Joel Belz and Marvin Olasky and Nick Eicher and all the people there, and it's just been great to have you on the program today. The book, one more time, They Say We Are Infidels, On the Run from ISIS with Persecuted Christians in the Middle East. It is published by Tyndale. It's actually Tyndale Momentum, which is a new imprint of Tyndale. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but if not, we've also given you a very easy link to that website. And as you go to that website, we might just mention that there are a number of resources. TheySayWeAreInfidels.com, or just follow the link. There is information about the book, or some free downloads, information, of course, about Mindy Belz, as well as a way in which you can purchase it. So, Mindy, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much, Kerby.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, change topics. And if you would like to join our conversation in the second hour, going to get into generosity, certainly thinking about our money from a biblical point of view. But two individuals that went to Harvard University and actually went to Harvard Business School and even took a class at Harvard Divinity School, and they began to rethink a lot of their priorities. And this book is endorsed by Randy Alcorn, who's been on the program with us before, and I think you're going to really enjoy that conversation with them as well. If you would like more information about either of the interviews that we are doing today, you can go to our website, pointofview.net. And, of course, we have given you an opportunity to watch a couple of videos. Matter of fact, the one for Mindy Belz is about 1:40. The one that we're going to talk about with God and Money in just a few minutes is about 2 minutes long, and we oftentimes encourage you to watch it. Then click that share button. Maybe put it on your Facebook page, put it on a blog, send it to somebody, and start a conversation. It's always a great opportunity for ministry. My commentary today is about the higher minimum wage. Are we doing people a favor by raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour? I mean, if it is such a good thing, then let's raise it to $25 an hour. How about $50 an hour? How about $100 an hour? I think you can see the fallacy there and, of course, the impact that it's going to have. So you can read my commentary and come to your own conclusions. That may be something else you might want to place on your Facebook page and get some conversation started as well. Let's take a break, though. We're going to come back and talk about God and money, how we can discover true riches. All that coming up right after this.
Later this year, for the 58th time, America will choose a president. As a Christian, what are you doing to prepare for the election? Helping you cut through the major media spin is part of the mission of Point of View. We want to provide the best election resources, including a new website, Pray, Organize, Vote, encouraging people to intercede for the upcoming election, to help you get registered so you can exercise the stewardship of voting, to share things to help you get people involved and out to the polls. But to do all of that, we need you to vote right now with your support for Point of View. Show us that you're in this for the long haul as a citizen of heaven as well as the United States. Click Donate Now at the top of the page and give the most generous one-time gift you can at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. There is a lot of work to be done. Let's get to it together. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
I've been looking forward to this program because it pulls together a lot of different themes that we talk about here on Point of View. One, of course, is we have been really tracking the millennial generation. Another, of course, is our biblical view of finances. My most recent book, A Biblical Point of View of Money and Making the Most of Your Money in Tough Times, certainly gets into some of these conversations, but also the issue of generosity and how we can really make strategic investments of our time and our talent and our treasure. And I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation today as we talk about this new book, God and Money: How We Discovered True Riches at Harvard Business School. It is written by John Cortines as well as Gregory Ballmer. Matter of fact, one is a saver, one is a spender, but we're going to talk about a third option in just a minute. And John actually launched his career in the Texas oil fields and decided eventually, though, to advance this biblical message of generosity full time. Before that, of course, he worked for various oil companies in Texas and Louisiana. He's a graduate from Texas A&M, as well as the KAU of Science and Technology. And, of course, as you might already have assessed, he also has an MBA, a Master's of Business Administration from Harvard Business School, and also took a course up there at Harvard Divinity School. And we've posted the video for you to watch because it kind of gets you into this conversation. This book, I think you're going to find very interesting. Forward by our good friend Randy Alcorn, who again will be on our program pretty soon here. And so, John, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, one of the things we have on that video is where you and Gregory were at a class there and seminary, and they asked you to take a dollar bill out of your wallet. And both of you reach into your wallet and realize the only thing you had in your wallet was a $100 bill, which probably created a bit of a stir among seminary students.
That's right. It was this funny moment where I just, all I was carrying was hundreds, and I pulled one out and saw Greg in the same situation. So we started laughing.
Yes.
Because we thought it was funny. But you're right, looked around the room. Of course, it's a seminary classroom, and it's an ocean of $1 bills, and then a bunch of people noticing us. So I don't think it was our best first impression that we've ever made.
One of the things, though, that early on caused you to think about this was when you were in a men's Bible study group, and you were really confronted with an interesting topic, and that is, as young Christians with very high earning potential, what would you plan to do with your money? Now, again, I guess I should say that Greg has kind of the spending mindset. You have the saving mindset. You can even share what your password was for your bank account, because it illustrates again that in either case, there was a lot of financial resources that were going to pass through your hands, and you were really challenged with what you would do with those resources, whether you would spend them on yourselves or whether you would build the kingdom.
That's right. You know, we were in this awesome men's Bible study that we found and ended up forming a group of 7 guys that committed to have a longer-term accountability relationship. So that group still exists even now that we've graduated. But one of those topics we talked about was money, and what does it look like if we happen to be really financially blessed? Like many graduates of this great school we get to go to are very blessed financially. So what would we do if we found ourselves in that situation? And, Greg and I were each Christians, grew up in wonderful Christian households, and I was taught to honor God with my money. But I think I didn't have a full understanding of what that meant. And so for me, it was tithing, just 10%. And for Greg, it was also tithing. And you're right. I was in the mindset, well, I'll tithe my 10% and then I'll save the rest. And so my wife Megan and I were saving half of our income before business school, whereas Greg, we were each earning six-figure incomes. Greg and his wife Allison before business school paid their tithe, gave their tithe, and then spent the rest. And so we had that spending and saving mindset down. But I think this class we took really opened us up to a third possibility, which would be the attitude of servant, the mindset of servant, which is to say, all that I have comes from God and is a resource potentially to be used for the greater glory of His name and to accomplish His ends in the earth. So that was the revelation for us over that semester.
The book is called God and Money. We have information published by Rose Publishing. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Breaks down into some sections, one on foundations, another on frameworks, another one on forward. And in the frameworks, that's where we'll talk about spending, saving, and serving. But before we get there, I thought it would be good for you, if you would, for just a few minutes, kind of give us an overview, because in order for you to really help people understand the message, I think it is really crucial for us to begin to think biblically about wealth and money and giving. And so it seems to me that we really need to give people at least kind of a quick survey of the Old and New Testament, don't we?
Sure, that'd be fantastic. So, actually one comment I would make is chapter 1 of our book is available for free download on godandmoney.net, and it's just all about what does the Bible say about money, the entire chapter. And so this was one of the most interesting discoveries that Greg and I made as we dug into God's Word, is that there is a consistent theme about money and the handling of wealth as it's associated with our standing with God all the way from Genesis to Revelation. And so we observe that. I would point out one anchor verse that I think defines this servant mindset. There's all kinds of scriptures we could go to, but this one I think is pivotal. It's in 1 Chronicles 29. So the nation of Israel has done a huge fundraiser led by King David to build the temple. And as we know, David didn't get to build the temple, Solomon did, but David helped raise the funds. And he makes this speech after they raise the money. And he's a great king. He's engaged in international trade. He's won wars. He's done a lot of things he could be proud of. This is the attitude he has. He says, "But who am I, and what is my people, that we should be able thus to offer willingly? For all things come from you, and of your own we have given you." And I think that mindset is really highlighted throughout Scripture as the mindset that we're called to have, and it honors God for His pivotal place in our lives and in our financial lives especially. And so we just love that verse. And of course, as we go on through the New Testament, Jesus talks, 40% of His parables deal with money. And so He focuses on themes of injustice is one, but also indifference. He calls us to consider the plight of those who are in need and really warns us against taking an attitude that is indifferent and concerned only for our own well-being and missing out on the chance to care for others.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into this in a little more detail, but for the Bible really have that much to say about money. One of the individuals that we've interviewed here on Point of View is Howard Dayton, and he categorized about 2,350 verses on money. If you deal with those that either deal with money directly or finances indirectly, or uses words like God, gold, and silver, people like Gene Getz and Randy Alcorn, and even when he was alive, Larry Burkett and others have come up with even larger numbers of those verses that deal with it. You cannot read through, say, the book of Proverbs without learning lots of principles about how to handle money, how to think about money, and also seeing some of the warnings about the dangers of rich kind of illustrations. So there's quite a bit. And we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about giving and tithing in the New Covenant, some of the teaching about that. And then we'll get into 7 core principles for biblical wealth and giving. And so if you have something to take notes with, you might number from 1 to 7, because we're going to go through some of these in a little more detail. And all of it is found in this new book, God and Money, How We Discovered True Riches at Harvard Business School. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, when California Governor Jerry Brown announced his plan to be the first state to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, lots of people had an opinion. Dr. Merrill Matthews, a frequent guest on Point of View, summarized his thoughts this way. As a Texan, let me say thank you, Governor Brown. He pointed out that Texas has benefited from the Golden State's determination to send its best employers and jobs to the Lone Star State. He believes that this announcement will assure that the relocation efforts will continue for years to come. Now, in case you're wondering, the number of Californians moving to Texas has hit an all-time high in nearly a decade. According to the IRS, it compiles migration data by looking at the address changes in the tax forms. Many of these people may be leaving for better job opportunities or fewer regulations, but increasing the minimum wage in California will also hasten the flight from the states. Talk show host Dan Celia predicted that there would be lots of bankruptcies throughout California by 2022. He couldn't believe that politicians in California wanted to do this in light of previous experiences elsewhere. Perhaps he speculated that politicians thought what happened in the state of Washington was just some sort of weird anomaly that is not going to happen anywhere else in the world. He reminds us that fast food chains had to lay off people and start pushing for automation systems, and is sure that there will be fewer people working as a result of the $15 hour wage. Of course, some workers will benefit because they will see their wages jump from $10 an hour to $15 an hour. Others will be laid off, but it won't stop there. People working for $12 an hour who have seniority won't be happy making $15 an hour, the same wage as someone new to the job. So they will demand a higher wage. In the end, wages might go up, but job opportunities will go down. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
John Cortines with us today as we talk about his book, God and Money, How We Discovered True Riches at Harvard Business School. He is one of the co-authors, and if you'd like to know a little bit more about the book or even download the first chapter, we've made it very easy for you to find all that at godandmoney.net. Also posted a video, and you know the drill. We encourage you to watch the video. It's about 2.5 minutes long, very easy, and very well done, by the way, and a lot of fun. But also we encourage you then to click that share button and maybe put it on your Facebook page, start a conversation, maybe pass it on to somebody in your church that needs to know about this, maybe your pastor. And if you have a blog, you might post it there as well. John, just before we get into some of those key principles for biblical wealth and giving, address the issue of the tithe. Now, I know we're not under the Old Testament law of the tithe, but it's a good kind of baseline principle. And in my book and in some of the research we've done with George Barna, we find that less than 10% give 10%. I think you're in the 2.5% on some of the graphs and charts you have there. So even if we're not supposed to necessarily have to give 10%, and actually I think the implications of the New Testament are we can give above and beyond that, frankly, we just don't have very many individuals right now that are actually giving any kind of significant amount to the Lord's work, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And, you know, we've had some conversations with people who see one line in our book that says we don't think new covenant believers are required to tithe, and we get pushback on that. And then we come back around and say, well, actually, what we're trying to say here is that God is interested in the 100%. He wants to know how we use every dollar that He's given to us in our lives and how we've allocated those for His purposes, some of which is to indeed bless our families and enjoy life. But I think it's far too easy to just say, I'll give 10% and then carve out the 90 for whatever I want to do. One interesting point on the tithe in our research that we uncovered is that there are 3 tithes if you study the Old Testament law.
Very true.
2 of them were 10% per year. One was every 3rd year. And so it's actually 23% of an Israelite's income that went toward the various tithes that were a part of their society. So it seems a little bit simplistic to just say 10% today, but maybe the standard year point could be even higher than that.
And again, I might just point people also to not only your good book, but the one by Randy Alcorn, Money, Possessions, and Eternity, in which he points that out, and others have done that as well. But also he has a quote or two from some of the early church fathers. You've got to recognize, John, that most of the early Christians, not all, but most of them came from a Jewish background. So most of them, when they became Christians, still carried with them the idea of giving at least 10% or coming to it the tithe and to give sacrificially. And then, of course, you see the Apostle Paul even addressing some of that in 2 Corinthians. So I think those are really important principles. And again, you can find that in the first chapter. And the good news is, even if you don't buy the book, you can download the first chapter, and we have that link at godandmoney.net. But let's, if we can, maybe for just a few minutes, work our way through some of these 7 core principles for biblical wealth and giving. And some of this, really, if nothing else, comes from some of the work that you did as you were surveying some of the Christian business leaders that you did as part of a Harvard Divinity School course. Can you explain a little bit about the course before we get into some of those principles?
Sure. The course was a great experience where we looked through what the Bible had to say about money and then also what the Christian theological tradition has to say. As you mentioned, the church fathers wrote a lot about this, and then through the centuries it has, of course, been a pertinent topic. But we, for our term paper, ended up surveying over 200 Harvard MBAs who were Christians in various stages of their careers and asked them all sorts of questions about their income, their net worth, and all this research is summarized in our book, but we saw some amazing examples of generosity, and it also, as you said, informed some of these principles that we distilled as the core ideas that the Bible contains on money.
And some of these people were giving incredible amounts, and we'll kind of maybe share some of that as we go along. But I'm encouraging some people, if they're listening right now, maybe to number 1 to 7, just to get these principles down. 4 deal with wealth, and 3 deal with giving. But principle number 1, everything we own belongs to God. Everything. We sort of illustrated that, but what else would you like to add? Because God's not concerned about just the 10%. He's concerned about the 100%, right?
That's right. I think this is a line, everything belongs to God. I think that's a line that's commonly stated, but very hard to put into practice. And so I think it's really about prayerfully submitting and seeking first the kingdom, as Jesus asks us to do. One line that Greg wrote this chapter, and one of the lines he has that I just love in this section, and even when we earn something, when we work hard to save money for a down payment on a house, we use skills that God gave us in a job that God gave us, in an organization and a political economy ordained by God, in a world that's held together moment to moment by God. And he has scripture references for all of those points, but yes. I think it's just important to remember that, we can't take credit. It's all from him and it's all for him.
Second principle, our wealth and possessions should be used for God's purposes. Again, just like the first one, we all sort of agree with that, but then to put it into practice is the tough part, isn't it?
It is, and an important point here, I think it's all of our possessions. So even if you think of your house, if you're blessed enough to have a house, what would you think if you said, well, this is God's house that he lets me live in? How would I use it differently? Could I be more welcoming? Could I open it up? Could I bless people by bringing them into my homes? That as one example, but just thinking of everything we have and using it for God's purpose, which is to reach the world with his truth and his message of salvation, and also to be a blessing to those in need.
2 more principles dealing with wealth. One, principle number 3, wealth is like dynamite with great potential for both good and harm. If you use the dynamite example, it can clear a path so that you can put in a road or you can level an area. Dynamite was used to actually build Mount Rushmore and things like that. But we also recognize how dynamite has been used to kill people in war. And wealth is the same kind of thing. It can be used for good or for evil. It can be used to build people up or tear people down. And that's why, again, we have to take for at least a little bit of time to recognize that there are destructive aspects to wealth, that if we're too wealthy, we might forget about God, as the Proverbs say.
That's right. One research study we cite in the book is a professor set up a rigged game of Monopoly where there's one rich player who gets more money in the game and one poor player. And even the players knew that it was rigged, and still the rich player halfway through the game would start talking about how their strategy was working and how they were so smart, and that's why they were winning the game. And I think it's just human nature to take credit for the good things that happen to us, and that's that's not untrue for someone who's blessed with wealth. So we have to be very careful in our hearts when we are blessed.
And the final fourth principle here, as we talk about wealth, and we'll get into giving, worldly wealth is fleeting, heavenly treasure is eternal. Jesus talks about laying up treasures in heaven rather than on earth. And yet again, those individuals, and you can think about this in Luke 12, you have the rich man storing up his wealth on earth, and Jesus uses a really harsh term to describe him. He says he's a fool for doing what most of us believe we're supposed to do. So how do we think our way through this?
That's right. There's a quote that we love that we found in our research that just says there are no U-Hauls behind a hearse. And, we all want to be responsible and plan for retirement, and certainly to be prudent is a good thing. But in that rich fool parable that Jesus talks about in Luke 12, he actually says, such it is with anyone who stores up treasure for themselves and is not rich toward God. And so the qualifier there is if you're self-absorbed in your desire to gain wealth and you're not open-handed towards the kingdom of God, therein is a problem.
Let's, if we can, take a break, and we'll come back and look at those three principles for giving. We've already talked about certainly four principles for wealth. Everything we own actually belongs to God. Our wealth and possessions should be used for God's purposes. Wealth is like dynamite with great potential for both good and harm. And then worldly wealth is fleeting. Heavenly treasure is eternal. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about giving. Giving generously to the poor is a moral duty in a fallen world. Giving should be voluntary, generous, even sacrificial, cheerful, and needs-based. And giving generously breaks the power of money over us. Those are the 7 core principles that we can look at. And then we're going to spend some time maybe talking about the 3S framework: a spender, a saver, and a servant. And then also conclude a little bit later in that last half hour with the issue of stewardship and some of the conclusions. So again, if you would like to maybe rethink some of your priorities and apply these to your finances, we certainly encourage you to find out more about this book, God and Money, How We Discovered True Riches at Harvard Business School. We have a link at godandmoney.net so that you can find some of that information there, and also a video. It's about 2.5 minutes long. I think you'll enjoy it because they're very engaging communicators, and at the same time, part of the millennial generation, which has, at least not yet, shown that it is giving at the same kind of percentage as, say, the builder generation or even some of the generations that preceded them, like the boomer generation. And so that is certainly something we need to be teaching in our churches and also modeling in our own lives. So if you would like to join the conversation, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. We'll talk about a few more of those principles, first for wealth, now for giving, and then talk about, are you a saver, a spender, or how about a servant? We'll come back with more right after this.
Is it just me, or does this year's election seem more contentious than ever? Even Christians are divided between which candidate to support, but one thing we must agree upon is the need to pray together. Each and every one of us must be on our knees asking God's mercy. Who is the right one to name the next Supreme Court justice, or 2 or 3? Honestly, I don't know, but God does. And we must petition Him to act. Point of View has created its own campaign in the midst of the presidential campaign, Pray, Organize, Vote. We want to remind you of things to pray about. We want to help you educate fellow believers and get them out to vote. Sign up today at pointofview.net. Click on the banner, Pray, Organize, and Vote. The future of America is at stake, and God's people are called to be good stewards of our votes. After you sign up, look at the bottom right corner for the red box that says Donate. Your gift will educate and motivate Christians during this critical time. Don't put it off. Visit now, pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Now, Cortines with us, as he is the co-author of the book God and Money, How We Discovered True Riches at Harvard Business School. And John, just before I get back to your book, let's talk about your website for just a minute, godandmoney.net. I've already mentioned the fact that people can download a chapter of the book to read, but you also have a whole section here on free resources. And if somebody wanted to teach this, or if somebody wanted to apply some of these principles, you have files, for example, a financial finish line calculator, a generosity covenant template. You have the verses that we've already mentioned, as well as a variety of other materials. Talk about how people, when they land on your website, can find some of those resources and use them either in their own individual study or even in a group study.
Sure, yeah, that's right. So there's actually also some great videos put out by Generous Giving, who is now my current employer, that we've referenced in the book and then have placed on the website for people to view. And like you mentioned, even the finish line calculator is a resource where you can go in and say, you know what, if I wanted to give my upside to God's kingdom and think through what that looks like, it's just kind of a template to put in some numbers, put in your age, put in some assumptions, and see what that looks like. So I'd encourage anybody to check that out.
And I would certainly encourage people to check out Generous Giving. We've talked about them before, but let's, if we can, get back to this issue of giving, because we mentioned 4 principles of those 7 dealing with wealth. Let's look at those 3 now for giving. The first one I mentioned just before I went to the break, giving generously to the poor is a moral duty in a fallen world. A lot of people would have thought that was optional. John, how are we supposed to think about this idea of giving to the poor?
Well, this was one of the most striking things as we went through Scripture. Jeremiah in chapter 22 is actually speaking to a king who's building a really nice house made of cedar. This is what Jeremiah says, speaking on behalf of the Lord. Do you think you are a king because you compete in cedar? Your father judged the cause of the poor and the needy, then it was well. Is not this to know me, declares the Lord. And so God cares so much about caring for the poor that he associates it with knowing him for those who go out and do so. So this was striking to us, and we just think that God has said it about as clearly as he can say it throughout the body of Scripture, that he wants us to care for those in need.
Another one, principle 6, giving should be voluntary, generous, even sacrificial, cheerful, and needs-based. I mean, a lot of that comes from, of course, 2 Corinthians, where it talks about God loves a cheerful giver. But explain that, fill that out a little bit more, this idea of needs-based and what giving needs to really reflect in terms of our generosity.
That's right. Well, I'd encourage anybody to do a deep dive in 2 Corinthians 9. This is it's the longest passage in the New Testament that is specifically focused on giving that we have from Paul. And yeah, he talks about whoever sows sparingly reaps sparingly, and whoever sows generously will reap generously. And it's not necessarily a prosperity gospel thing, but he talks about how God will increase the harvest of our righteousness when we sow into God's kingdom financially. And so it's a promise that we'll see returns, but not necessarily money back to us, but the glory of God and our righteousness as an impact in the world. So it's really a great passage I'd encourage anybody to look at in 2 Corinthians 9.
Well, we're talking about attitude. One of the things that runs through your book also is this idea that our generosity is not measured maybe in absolute numbers. So talk about, how do we measure it? Do we measure it in terms of our motivation, our heart? How should it be measured?
I think this is reflected somewhat in when Jesus saw the widow give her 2 mites and praised that relative to the money bags of the Pharisees. And, you know, we have this idea. There's actually an A.W. Tozer quote that says, "My service to God will not be measured by what I have done, but by what I could have done." And so I think it's this idea of the talents. Whatever God has given us, be it much or little, he's not interested in whether I gave $100 or $1 million. He's interested in how did I respond to what he gave me, and what is the totality of that. It's all back to that idea of the 100%.
Very good. 7th principle and final one, giving generously breaks the power of money over us. You know, this was probably true in the first century, but I think it's really true today, because I have a chapter in my new book that deals with materialism and consumerism, and there is so much more that is kind of calling for us to spend more, to own more, and so in some respects, money has as much, if not a greater power over us than it did even in the past.
That's right. Jesus nailed this when he said, you cannot serve both God and money or mammon in the scripture. But just like an addict says, I could quit if I wanted to, I think the servant of money says, I could give generously if I wanted to, right? But the real test is does the rubber hit the road? Stepping out in faith in generosity is something where God will meet us, and we can begin to serve him rather than serving our finances in our lives.
Just before we get into the frameworks, the spender, saver, and servant, I thought for just a minute we might talk about some of the motivations for giving, because you make not only a moral case for giving, but I love it, a medical case for giving as well, which I thought would be kind of intriguing. Most people maybe have never thought about that before.
This was very fascinating, and so there's great projects going on at Notre Dame called the Science of Generosity Project, but they've studied the lives of over 2,000 American families in great depth and detail, and they've looked at habits of generosity and how it correlates to different outcomes in life. But it's amazing, everything from the incidence of health issues to minor things like headaches to more major things. But when people live generous lives, it actually is a mindset of abundance, and that mental process that gets kick-started when we live in that mindset of sharing and caring for other people is fundamentally good for us, and we carry less stress around, counterintuitively, actually, when we live that way. But, the Bible clearly identifies that it's more blessed to give than receive, and it's fascinating that modern medical science is corroborating that today in the 21st century.
A couple of times, spender, saver, or servant. We've already kind of mentioned that your co-author, Greg, he was kind of in the spender category. Talk about what that is, because, again, it is real easy to get into a spending mindset in this world. And so if you can, help us understand that, because a spender really is, if you will, investing in the present, isn't he?
That's right. And one thing that to be clear on is that every family, hopefully, will spend some money, save some money, and serve others with some money. And so it's not about necessarily where those dollars go, but it's about the heart. And so a great test would be if somebody handed you 1 month's pay tomorrow, what do you instantly think of? Do you think about all the plans you have for spending and a new vacation? Do you think about, I'm going to put this on the mortgage immediately? That would be me as the saver. Or are you like my neighbor who recently had that situation happen, and they've been wanting to adopt a child, and they said, wow, we can use every dollar towards this adoption and grow God's kingdom by being generous. And so that's the servant mindset, is to say, whatever resources come into my life, I'm going to try to think about how I could use them for God's purposes.
So again, the spender is really investing in the present. The saver, if you will, is really investing in the future. And that was you. You were wanting to retire at 40. But the server is really investing in eternity through giving. So what does that look like? Obviously, we have to spend, we have to save. But it's, again, resources that come through our hands, and I'm going to broaden it from just the money, because it's your time, your talent, and your treasure. And treasure is part of that, but also where you give your time and resources, and how you invest those are going to either be for the present or the future, but the best investment is for eternity, right?
That's right. And one great example we saw of this across our research is that people were asking the question, how much should I keep, rather than how much do I need to give? And I think that's the servant mindset. And so for those who are blessed with significant resources, asking and answering that question of, maybe I can draw a finish line and say, this is enough salary for my family to be quite happy and provided for. All of the upside beyond that can be invested in God's work. And we saw families that were doing this, and it just blew us away. And so we were inspired to do something similar in our life, which led to those generosity covenants that you mentioned earlier.
When we come back from the break, I'd like to spend just a little bit of time maybe having you share one or two stories. Of course, in your video, you talk about a hedge fund manager that gives so sacrificially. And, of course, as you had a chance to do some of these interviews with graduates of the Harvard Business School who were Christians, it would be really good to begin to spend just a little bit of time learning from them, because sometimes they can be a real motivation. But also, again, I want to encourage those of you listening to consider using this book, not only to maybe reevaluate your own giving and your own activities, but also to think about whether this would be a good way to teach some of this, maybe in a Sunday school class, or to have a special
and I think you're going to find at Harvard Business School. And again, we have one video, but as you go to their website, godandmoney.net, you'll see some other videos and some other resources as it breaks down into foundations, frameworks, and then, as we'll talk about in just a minute forward, the issue of stewardship and how we've maybe seen that play out in the lives of individuals. It is published by Rose Publishing. You can look for it in your local bookstore, but we have a way for you to order it and even download a free copy of one of the chapters so that you can read it and learn more. We'll take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
John Cortines with us as we talk about the book that he co-authored, God and Money, How We Discovered True Riches. And John, just before we run out of time, let's, if you can, maybe share a few of the stories of some of the individuals. Were there differences? What caused them to be different than others that you might have surveyed, or even individuals that we actually go to church with?
Sure. We were doing some follow-up interviews with several of the people who took our survey, and this is where Greg and I started to just have our minds blown by what we were hearing. So one example, there's a hedge fund guy, manages a hedge fund, earns millions of dollars per year, and I'm the guy who wanted to retire at 40, as you would recall. So he's telling us this, and I'm thinking, okay, great, he probably has saved up millions of dollars, and he told us, guys, wealth talks about how money and wealth is dangerous to the human heart. And so I avoid accumulating wealth, and that's the point, where my jaw hits the floor. But he just continues on. I don't build wealth year on year. I am saving a little bit for retirement. That's a long-term thing, but I basically flush it all every year. I live a nice upper middle class life with my family. We wouldn't look too different from any of your friends. And we give, a seven-figure sum of money every year because he was having so much fun and saw what the Bible warned about. And his journey began in Scripture, just like ours did. So he read through the Bible to see what it had to say about money, just like Howard Dayton did. So the Word of God is living and active, as we know, and it's really, really powerful on this topic of our finances.
Now, one of the things that you talk about is this idea of your finish line, because that's different for different individuals. But what it would be to live a modest life, but at the same time, you've got some kids, someday you're thinking about them going to college, and of course, just even before they go to college, they get to be very expensive. I'll give you a clue right now. That's certainly what you're going to be facing. So what about that? Because in some respects, what that individual, and you can mention some of the others, you got the Bomber family and some others in here, these are individuals that sort of made a decision as to what would be a reasonable kind of lifestyle, and also what could be a possible cap that gives the rest of that to giving to the Lord's work. So kind of help us think through what that means and what that looks like for just a minute.
Sure. Well, we love to use specifics, and anyone who reads our book will see that we use specifics all the time. And so just to put that out there, the Bomber family and my family each committed that we wouldn't spend more than $100,000 per year on our families. And that's been, that's a really nice life. So it's not some sort of self-imposed poverty by any means. It's just to say, okay, God, if you give us millions of dollars, we're going to give away millions of dollars. We are not going to absorb that for our own gain. And, one good example I could give you, who we mention in the book, Generous Giving, has a video on him. His name's Alan Barnhart. Mm-hmm. He founded a company. He started a company with his brother. It grew to be worth over $250 million. And they literally gave their company away. He has raised his 6 children on a salary of $140,000 a year. He had all of his kids pay for half of their own education, and meanwhile has given away, at this point, over $20 million per year, I believe. And I met his son, and he's not bitter, not upset about his dad, actually thrilled at the investing they got to do in God's work around the world.
That's amazing. One of the people that you probably have come in contact with, because he wrote the foreword, Randy Alcorn, I know that you got to him fairly early on. And of course, if you have read his book or even know him, as I've known him for many years, you know that he has, because of a circumstance that developed out of a protest at an abortion clinic, made the choice, because he did not want that money that they would garnish from his wages going to abortionists, have really made a choice to live at a minimum wage all of his life.
That's right. It's unbelievable. We were, as you said, had the wonderful opportunity to meet Randy, whose writings were very influential in our journey, and to hear about the amount of money that he's given away and the fun that he has with his family, choosing the causes that they support, sending those enormous checks out that they earn from royalties, and then how generous they are. It's truly is more blessed to give than receive, and it's visible in his life.
Next time I get him in here, maybe I can get him. He's pretty humble, but maybe he'll let us know how many millions have gone through, because, of course, his books have been so successful and so profitable, whether it's his book on heaven or his one that we're going to be talking about on happiness, or the one on money, or many of the others, and even his fictional books. All of those have gone to the advancement of the gospel, and it's just been really incredible to watch. And so, again, it's kind of got where your finish line is, and that may be different for different people. As you point out, it's a lot more expensive to live, say, in the San Francisco Bay Area than it is in the middle of Kansas or something like that. But still, to think through some of those principles are really important. And what would you say to your fellow millennials? Because one of the things we've noticed is that individuals that have really supported missions and churches, then it dropped off a little bit for baby boomers, dropped off even more for baby busters. By the time we get to your generation, millennials, in terms of giving, that's not a big deal for them. And so it seems to me that we need to have, if you will, almost a financial and spiritual reformation that takes place in the minds of individuals to begin to see how to apply biblical principles of money and giving to their very lives.
Absolutely. And it's interesting. I think, God is a God of compassion, and he's also a God who issues an invitation. And so our generation faces so many challenges that are in some regards unprecedented in recent history, at least the level of student loan debt. I have some, Greg has some, our peers have them. The challenges with, finding good jobs as millennials. But I would say, all of that taken into consideration, God still issues an invitation to generosity. The people that the Bible was written to were far more poor than we are today. And yet Jesus still said to them that they should give and should give to the poor and should test God with their generosity and experience what he would do. And so I would just say to anyone, the most toxic word that we can say is later. Yeah. I'll be generous later when I have a steady job. I'll be generous later when I get my kids through college. I'll be generous later when. Fill in the blank, but whatever our capacity and ability is now, to cheerfully say, God, I choose to be generous because you are generous, and I want to experience what it's like in my life to be like you, Lord. And so I'm going to try out generosity. That's what I would say to my generation, frankly, to any generation.
Yeah, and try it out. And do it when you're poor. I mean, my wife and I started doing that when we were in graduate school. I went to that other school, Yale. And as a result, that was something that we had an opportunity to see and apply. And then as your income increases, to have that follow it and to really start that principle and not to postpone it till later. Well, John, it's been great to have you on the program. And again, this is a book that I would commend to our listeners, God and Money, How We Discovered True Riches at Harvard Business School. It's been a delight to have you on the program, and so thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Just before we run out of time, let me mention again that you can go to godandmoney.net. Great resources there, including some guides that you can use, some videos. We've already posted one video that I thought you might like to watch. And again, my assignment to you is to watch the video. It's only going to take you 2.5 minutes. And then if you can think of somebody that maybe needs to see that, click that share button and send it to them. It could be your pastor. It could be maybe somebody who's responsible for finances or missions in your church. It could be a friend or a neighbor, or it could be somebody you post. You could maybe post on your Facebook page or blog or something like that, and just a resource that would start a great conversation and cause people to begin to think about how to apply a biblical perspective to their finances. Well, that's all we have for today. I want to encourage you to visit the website, pointofview.net. You can find out more about the book by Mindy Belz, as well as the book by John Cortines and Gregory Baumer, and all of that is available at the website, pointofview.net. Let me also mention that we have our Viewpoints commentary today for you to actually read, and it relates to some of the issues of money, in this case, minimum wage. And I hope that you'll visit the website, and if you can click on that button that says donate, we would appreciate that as well. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Shamila for their help behind the scenes, and we will see you back here tomorrow.
Later this year, for the 58th time, America will choose a president. As a Christian, what are you doing to prepare for the election? Helping you cut through the major media spin is part of the mission of Point of View. We want to provide the best election resources, including a new website, Pray, Organize, Vote, encouraging people to intercede for the upcoming election, to help you get registered so you can exercise the stewardship of voting, to share things to help you get people involved and out to the polls. But to do all of that, we need you to vote right now with your support for Point of View. Show us that you're in this for the long haul as a citizen of heaven as well as the United States. Click Donate Now at the top of the page and give the most generous one-time gift you can at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. There is a lot of work to be done. Let's get to it together. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I want